trust me, there is a lot to unpack here. I didn't even know where to begin. But I'll tell you one thing for definite, is that not one Red Bull driver came out of this weekend smelling of roses, not even Liam Lawson. And I'm sure that Charles Leclerc's race suit probably doesn't smell all that rosy after he went off at the last corner. But we got to start off with the winners, and it was quite clear. Ferrari were one of the biggest winners here. And even though Leclerc wasn't quite as fast as he would have liked to have been in the first phase of the race, a podium was an easy feat, considering that even if Max hadn't got those 2 penalties, don't worry, we'll talk about that later, he would have been a distant 4th behind Norris and the 2 Ferraris. It was still good points to secure P3 in the driver's standings at minimum, as well as, of course, him doing his part in not only Ferrari securing 2nd place in the constructors, no, Ferrari completely blasted past Red Bull quite convincingly, scoring over 40 points and actually getting within striking distance of McLaren. So, this is going to be a very, very historically driven battle, and I am all for it. As for Carlos, I'm pretty sure that James Vowles just had to change his trousers with how comfortable he was all weekend, and then getting his 4th win in F1. And not to mention for the fact that he actually managed to buck the trend, as has become quite commonplace in recent years. We've become really conditioned to, if we see Max Verstappen getting past people into turn 1 or off the start, we just go, well, that's that then, okay, alright, we're done. That overtake was a decade in the making, back when those 2 drivers were teammates at Toro Rosso. There was something personal there, and I bet that Sainz felt really good after that. And I'm betting that Carlos Sainz Sr. was very, very pleased with himself, and probably wanting to give Jos Verstappen a little bit of a gesture. One that I cannot show you here, but Liam Lawson showed to the world later on in the race. In any case, I'm pretty sure with Carlos Sainz getting the win at the Mexico City Grand Prix, it would have helped ease the pain somewhat of all the struggles that Sergio Perez had to go through throughout that entire weekend, and especially the race, and of course qualifying. Also, there is a building case that Ferrari could jump McLaren in the Constructors simply because the Drivers' Championship isn't really on the cards for either Ferrari driver at present. But the Constructors, that matters a lot to Ferrari, because if you work for Ferrari, you work for the entire operation. It will matter so much to the Tifosi if they can get the Constructors after 16 years, and Carlos will be immortalised amongst the fans of the Scuderia because he played a really good part in it. Then, of course, we got to have Lando Norris, and even though he didn't win the Grand Prix, he did get a really good 2nd place and 10 points off of Verstappen. And put simply, Lando was the stronger of the 2 drivers at this weekend. And that was really helped by the fact that Verstappen was still dealing with some engine gremlins which sort of crept up around Austin, and that meant that he didn't really get any good data on Friday in terms of race stints, so it meant that even if they hadn't had that argy-bargy and Max got those penalties, but because of what happened in turn 4 and turn 8, it led to Max going down a whole pit stop, and therefore he lost even more points. And even though Lando didn't get Carlos in the end, he did get within 5 seconds of the Spaniards, which will make him happy. It would be a sense of pride, and he also got to celebrate with the Sainz family anyway, to celebrate the boys' win. So hey, it was a good weekend overall. He is now under 50 points behind Verstappen, which does mean now we can actually get into Qatar, at least at the moment. It all depends on what happens in Brazil. Now actually thinking that, hey, this might actually get to Abu Dhabi after all. And even though Max Verstappen might win the championship anyway at this point, if we can at least just get to the last race, not knowing for sure who is going to win the title, that's going to be a good thing. Or it could actually get really, really bad, and we might get a repeat of Abu Dhabi 2021 in how much drama ensues over the course of the winter. Let's just hope the FIA doesn't get involved and it's just on track between the 2 drivers if it's going to happen at all. And then we've got Haas. I think Aston Martin should really be starting to sweat right now. Even though Haas are still 40 points behind them, this is yet another race where both Magnussen and Hülkenberg scored. And in terms of his legacy, Kevin was the highest scoring of the 2. And even though Magnussen won't be in Formula 1 next year, this will be really good for his pride and his future in motorsport, because it's going to be quite clear he'll be going back to America, probably in IMSA, because he did enjoy himself in his year out of Formula 1 when Haas were doing really, really badly, and Gunther actually did him a kindness in not being right at the back of Formula 1 and instead potentially fighting for glory in sports cars. He's now scored double figures, 14 points, he's 13th in the championship, which has been his best for quite a while, and this has just been really good for his psyche and realising that, hey, he's still got it, and it's redeemed some of all of the quirks and the anonymity that he had last year. And Hülkenberg, even though he didn't score as many points, he still scored and he was still faring quite nicely. And yes, of course, Piastri was closing in on Kevin, but ultimately, the Australian couldn't actually get past him in the end. He ran out of time. And as Komatsu pointed out, this is probably the best he saw Kevin driving at Haas, which is really counting for something. And at this rate, he actually might leap past Tsunoda and Stroll in the championship. And there is something about this team which is beginning to crystallise, and the pace of their regeneration is nothing short of remarkable given how much less in terms of resources they have compared to other teams, maybe even less than Williams. And even though people might be thinking, oh, it's because of Toyota, no, it's still too early to say for definite that their influence is actually making a major impact on the track. But just them being there might be a psychological boost, that there might be more to it. And we're now starting to see more prominently that sticker on the car, that being Gene's machine, in that Gene's actually taking more of an interest, because apparently he's been to more races this year than he has in quite a few years at this point. He's more motivated, he's fired up, and that might mean he might spend more money on the operation, seeing it's actually generating stuff. They're really close to getting 50 points in 1 year, which is a huge achievement for them. Yeah, I'm bundling Aston Martin in as a technical loser here in association to Haas's victory. Just you wait till next year. I think this will only kick on even more. Behrman and Ocon will be so happy right now. And Hulkenberg, I don't know how he's feeling right now, whether or not Audi might actually be better. I mean, next year, I don't think Sauber's really going to be scoring as many points, but still. At least he's having a good run and he's still got it, but seriously, Esteban, I don't think he cares what's going on at Alpine at the moment. Haas is looking really good. And you know what? I'm going to put Mercedes here. And you might be confused with this placement, and they only finished ahead of Verstappen because of his 20-second penalty. But when you take all of that and put that to the side, having both cars just a few seconds behind Max as the team tries to problem solve the car ready for next year, this was not the worst outcome possible. I think it's quite clear that Mercedes aren't going to be winning any races unless there are some major incidents between Ferrari, Mercedes and Red Bull, and Mercedes are there to pick up the pieces, because that might be evident. But they still scored more points than Red Bull did, and even though they probably won't leapfrog past Red Bull because there are only 4 races and 2 sprint races to go, I bet it will be a source of pride if they can at least get to within 100 points of Red Bull, at least get that sort of spread, and Toto will be rubbing his hands with glee. And yes, I'm actually really satisfied with the discord happening at Red Bull. Christian can go hang for this one. And also, both drivers produced some really good feedback and entertainment for us all with a really good, clean battle, which didn't result in any damage or any complaints from either driver. And also, it was really valuable knowledge because George had the Silverstone spec and Lewis the most recent spec for Mexico. And also, you gotta keep an eye on this battle between Lewis and George because this is a matter of pride. Currently, in terms of who finishes ahead of the other in the championship, it's 1 apiece. So this is going to be the last season where they're teammates, so it really matters to both of them. And hey, Kimi, he did a good job in FP1. He was second only to Colapinto, who's actually had quite a few race weekends under his belt now. So, yeah, hey, maybe Kimi might actually do good when he actually gets a few races under his belt himself. Not bad. And then there's Pierre Gasly. And even though Pierre was involved in the tangle which saw his best friend Yuki and Albon eliminated, he didn't cause it, but he was partly why Albon had nowhere to go. It was a racing incident. He came out of it unscathed, and Alpine came away with a point. And even though Pierre is quick to admit that, yeah, a single point really shouldn't be something they are celebrating with jubilation, this is a little bit more progress for Alpine as they regenerate in becoming a customer team to Mercedes in 2026 and moving away from the works operation. This is another step forward in their restructuring phase and then no longer being a joke. Oliver Oaks may not be exciting, but that's probably what this team needs, a little bit of blandness to try and get themselves away from the limelight for all the wrong reasons and back in for the right reasons. It worked for Haas because remember at the beginning of the year, Haas was seen as dull, Komatsu uninspiring, and now look where he is. People are heralding him for his leadership skills. Maybe the same thing might happen with Oaks next year, and Alpine kick on, and Briatore, even though he is a controversial figure, and I did lament his arrival, he has actually been somewhat of a steadying force in a way, because he has been away from the headlines somewhat. He's just been quietly doing his job. And even though Ocon was unfortunate, he started from the pit lane, he did get up to 13th. And I don't think he really cares that Pierre is the more favoured driver of the two, because, hey, he's looking to Haas on what they're doing right now and what Toyota had. And he had no idea about that deal with Toyota, apparently, Esteban. So I'm pretty sure he's grinning like a Cheshire cat, whereas Pierre, he's got all the hard work. Sure, he won the battle of the 2 Frenchmen, but now this is his bed for him to lay in. And then we get to the mess section. And I'm going to start off with Piastri here, and I'm conflicted. I really am. This is a second Q1 exit in a row. Yes, I know in Austin it was Q1 in sprint qualifying, but my point still stands, and track limits is becoming a issue that is of cause for concern. And I would have put Oscar in the losers section had it not been for the fact that actually he did do the deed and get the car back in the points, and he looked really quick doing it. And even though he did start off quite slowly, it took him longer than it should have done to get past joable people, he ultimately came away with 8th place, and it could have been slightly more. He did run out of time against Magnussen, and he did get to within 6 seconds of Verstappen, and again, more time was required, and he should have really kicked on earlier on in the race. But there was no way I was going to put him in the winner section. Absolutely not. Because Saturday, I got nothing. The boy done goofed. He made mistakes. Yeah, I'm not ashamed to admit that. And also, what was really, really evident is that this was the first weekend I saw Oscar lose his cool. Because he was starting to get really, really frayed behind the likes of Lawson, and with Russell right up his chaff, he was saying, hey, do you think we can do something to, stop this, expletive? Oscar said a swear. And seriously, are McLaren really scared of undercuts? Because every single time there's been an opportunity for an undercut, they don't take it. And even though he did get past Liam ultimately, it was still an indicator there is a modicum of unease with the driver after 2 weekends in a row, where going wide has led to his weekend being harder than it should have been. The car was with him though, and its forgiving nature on the tyres did help him immensely, and sliced 14 seconds between him and Verstappen over the course of the race. But there is something that does count in Piastri's favour, the reason why he was so far behind Lando, and why his siding through the order wasn't as quick as many people would have expected, considering what Lando was able to do. He was not running the full upgrade package brought from Mexico. Apparently, according to Andrea Stella, he will have the full set of upgrades and updates for Brazil. So he might see him improve, and he will definitely improve, of course he will. Because remember, last year, he was a lap down after turn 1 because he had to come into the pits. There was that weird miscalculation with the whole situation. I think the race got red flagged or something like that. Ricardo was affected by it. So yeah, it's a guarantee. Oscar will definitely do better this year than last year. And maybe he might be a little bit more able to help Lando, because we've got to remember here, this could be a situation where if Piastri has more of these incidents where he goes out in Q1 or has a track limits issue which compromises his ability to actually help Lando, this could cost the constructors. That too is an observation that I am willing to make. So this is something that Oscar really needs to actually curtail, these track limits mistakes, and he knows that they are mistakes. Then there's Colapinto. This too was a toss-up, honestly. And there are arguments to put him in the winners section due to the fact that he was the more fortunate of the 2 Williams drivers over the weekend. And there are rumours regarding his future starting to circulate, more likely of him going to VCARB, with Val stating that this might be a viable option. How long for remains to be seen. Do I see him going into the Red Bull family for good as a permanent move? I don't think so. I think this might be a 2-year lease deal with a bungee cord option that, if Williams wants him back, they can take him back without penalty immediately with little warning in case either Albon or Sainz moves on to pastures new after 2026. Having said that though, Franco did admit that what he did over the course of the weekend was just not good enough. It wasn't quite there to get into the points, but he did get up quite a few positions. And then of course we did get a little encounter, and I was really looking forward to this. I knew this would happen between he and Lawson, and Franco did come out the victor, albeit it wasn't clean because Lawson did lose his front wing. He had to come into the pits at near the end of the race. And then he and Piastri, Franco, they had a nice little bit of a ding-dong into turn 1. And yes, it wasn't entirely clean as well. There was a banging of wheels, but neither got damage. So yeah, it didn't result in any points or anything like that, but it was still a solid weekend for Franco, and we got to see more of him being showcased by Williams. The deal with Mercado Libre for the yellow airbox, the engine cover for the Williams, it was a nice little throwback to the 90s Williams. All that's missing now is a white side pod, and you have the emulation of the Canon Camel collaboration in terms of sponsors. That was missing, but still, it's nice that they're embracing this, and we're going into Brazil. The further behind Franco is going to be even more palpable. And you know what? I'm going to put Stroll here as well. Yeah, he didn't get any points, but there were some moments where Lance looked kind of strong. He was making moves, and he wasn't propping up the back of the grid or having an anonymous day. And yes, of course, losing out to an Alpine and a Haas really is not going to help Aston Martin's case, or the case for Stroll being in the miss section. But Lance was actually not slow, and he was actually on the world feed, and he was doing something. So hey, with Aston Martin where they are right now, you know what? I'm going to throw them a bone. Lance actually did something and was not terrible. Yeah, okay, now I'll talk about Lawson. This has been definitely a defining race for his future career, and I conducted polls on both Twitter and Threads about whether people's stance toward him had changed over the course of this race, and it was a bit of a mixed bag. On Twitter, folks came out liking him more, whereas on Threads, the reaction from this race was more mixed, with a slight lean toward people liking Liam less. And I do see the bind here, I really do. Whilst I admit that Liam is making an impression and he is fighting for his life here, he's not just doing a softly approach, and maybe Red Bull might take comfort in that they've got a really punchy youngster. If Max Verstappen were to leave Formula 1 altogether, they might be in good hands here. He was motivated to make an impression on Sunday due to the fact that he missed out on Q3 potentially after his teammate put it in the barriers, brought out the red flag, and saw both V-carbs out in Q2. Instead, we got a battle between Lawson and Checo, and then also Lawson and Colapinto. So we actually got us, and for us we got more entertaining battles, but for Lawson, they were more complex ones and more dramatic ones. And he chose to emulate the young David Coulthard with the use of his digit towards Checo. He has since apologised for that, but what you've got from this weekend is there a clear animosity between the two drivers, and it can be understandable. Liam is coming after Checo's job, and Sergio's trying to put him in his place. Or at least, he attempted to do so, but came off the worse when he sustained that damage to his side pod. But I won't put Liam in the loser section here because there were circumstances beyond his control. Like I said, he might have had a chance at going to Q3, but that was stopped by Yuki. Then he had the encounter with Perez, but apparently, according to some people, this was off the main world feed, that apparently Checo was dive bombing and brake testing Liam at one point, and the middle finger was a response to all of that chicanery instead of just a general showing of frustration for the sake of it. And also, Liam did fulfill the assignment in coming in to take the fastest lap point away from Lando Norris. And yes, of course, it did trigger Leclerc to come in and take the point away from Liam, so it means Ferrari got it, but this was a case of the Scuderia trying to hammer it home that they were taking second place away from Red Bull. But Liam did what he was told to do, and he did it well. He accomplished it, whereas Checo did not. And also, pay attention to the language, because right now, externally, both Marco and Horner are saying, yeah, no, Liam did a good job and he was not helped by other circumstances, but he's still got a lot to learn. He's still a bit rough around the edges. But no, internally, they might be going, that's really good, Liam. You gave it a go, and we like that. Because you got to remember, we're in Mexico. They can't come out, Red Bull, favouring Liam. They've got to be at least a bit more sympathetic toward Checo. But one thing is for darn sure, Liam, right now, is certainly not popular amongst Spanish-speaking audiences. First he had his beef with Alonso, now with Checo. Is Carlos next? And considering he's in a Williams next year, I wouldn't put it past him. And then we get to the loser section, and Verstappen tops this list. Now, this could have been worse, and seen Verstappen out of the points, as his 20-second penalty did force his hand into an earlier stop than most, and his tyre delta was one of the weaker ones amongst the front runners. Now, when it comes to those 10-second penalties that he got, we got to remember that this year, it's the standard that is 10 seconds, and considering that it's quite clear that Max Verstappen knows the rulebook inside and out, he would be fully aware that the minimum now is 10 seconds. 5 seconds in Austin, that was them being lenient toward Lando. And this is something that we've got to take into consideration. And this is probably why Max wasn't blowing off his lid on the team radio as much as we expected. Sure, he was a little bit sarky, but he was actually relatively restrained. And even though there was somewhat of a debate to be had with the situation in Austin, when it comes to Mexico, no, there wasn't really an argument. These penalties were somewhat justified because going into turn 4, Lando had the corner, and he would have actually pulled off the manoeuvre over Verstappen had he not been forced off the track. Lando did give the place back to Sainz, and ultimately it then led to turn 8, where Verstappen, yes, he had the corner into turn 8, yeah, he had the place, but he wasn't able to complete the move cleanly because he then went wide, and that forced Lando off as well, and almost into the wall, so it could have been worse, and it could have seen Norris out, and maybe Max Verstappen hit with another penalty or something like that. But one thing was for sure, it allowed Leclerc through and pulled away, and basically meant that second place was neither driver's until right at the very end for Norris. And even though 10 seconds, it may sound harsh, that is the norm because, as has become quite evident, 5 seconds, it's water off a duck's back to most drivers. They can just get 5 seconds ahead and then the penalty's rendered moot. No, it's got to make an impact. And Red Bull, they're not challenging the decision like McLaren did in Austin in order to try and get a conversation and dialogue going. Here, They're not disputing that, although Horner is saying that the 10 seconds is somewhat harsh, or maybe the second one or something like that. That maybe one was enough as a joint penalty. But it's just something to really take into consideration that at this point, Verstappen is now starting to realise that Lando's getting that little bit more punchy. And sure, advantage is certainly with the Dutchman at the moment, but this might only be the beginning. And that Lando is actually starting to hold his own more and gaining confidence, so just watch the space. And then there's the other Red Bull driver, Perez. This was not a good race for Sergio, and not even Christian Horner could defend it. Him taking a leaf out of Val's book and alluding to a meritocratic viewpoint on the day, and saying that difficult decisions might have to be made, simply down to the fact that on this day, Red Bull are now third in the constructors, and the last time that we've seen a world champion taken by a team and them not being in the top two was back in 1983, and that is probably a record that Christian does not want to have. The constructors matters a lot to Christian, considering he cut his teeth with his own team Arden back in the day. And the reason why Checo is down here is not simply down to the fact that he had a Q1 departure. That's become, sadly, all too common given this year. And even Checo has acknowledged that this season has been absolutely terrible, even worse than 2023. But all of this mostly was down to him coming off worse when tangling with Lawson, which left the side pods damaged and put paid to any hopes of a fight back into the points. And he just looked really, really ragged and sloppy somewhat, and Checo has actually become aware of this. He's apologised for all the stuff that he got himself into, and that even though he finished the race, he was the last of the finishers. There is clear tension behind the scenes, and it's spilling out onto the track. Put simply, Liam is after Checo's job, and things are starting to get a little bit fractious here. And people are now harking back to the decision that Red Bull made to retain Sergio Perez through this year and next year and maybe 2026. We've got to remember that 2-year extension is a 1+1 deal. So the odds of Checo getting that extension into 2026, it's not looking likely. 2025 might start to be looking a little bit dicey. And would Checo accept the demotion down to VCARB? No, I don't think so. I think this is it. And the justification for Horner to keep Checo was down to the fact that the upcoming races after Spa were looking like they would be advantageous to Checo. No, we've not really seen anything fiery. I don't think Checo's even been in the top 5. Now, I'm not counting against Checo. As far as I'm concerned, he's got a contract for next year at the very least. That's not what I'm getting at, but you got to admit, this weekend, it's not been a good one for he or Red Bull. And then there's the other Red Bull driver, Yuki. Not a popular person amongst their camp after his incident in Q2, which limited he and Lawson from perhaps broaching the top 10. And then turn 1 happened. Now, even though I will give Yuki his due in that he's actually acting more calm and collected in terms of his reaction, he's not flying off the handle anymore, and he's actually accepting responsibility, it's still a really big issue, and Lawson has come out the better of the two, even though he himself got embroiled in a lot of drama this weekend. And Yuki's trying to justify getting that Abu Dhabi test in an RB20 to try and justify he and Honda's desire to have him next to Max Verstappen in the future. But in my honest opinion regarding the situation, I think Red Bull's stonewalling the issue until after the Honda deal lapses, and then Red Bull's not contractually obliged to have Yuki next to Max Verstappen, or indeed in their team at all. They can just let him go. And to top it all off, they've lost even more ground to Haas, and that is something they cannot afford to do. And then Albon. It's a bit of a mixed bag for him here. Granted, his efforts of getting into Q3, which were aided by Tsunoda's crash, should really be given credit because, hey, he actually did good. That Williams can be competitive, and he made the most of that situation. And it could have led Williams getting a couple of more points. But this might have been a brilliant response to all of the good form that Franco's had in the last few races. But sadly, it wasn't meant to be. It was out of his hands in a simple racing incident. It was just rotten luck, and it came at a really, really bad time. Then there was the incident in practice with Behrman and the crash that ensued. Was that idiot comment aimed at Oliver or at himself for bending the car? It's not entirely clear. But that wasn't the start he needed for the weekend, and the efforts he did pull out of the hat were then thwarted due to an incident like in Suzuka with Ricciardo, also in a V-carb. And then there was Zhou. That's quite obvious here, and Bottas was the better driver and at some points troubled the points positions, whereas Zhou, he really couldn't do much. And I do acknowledge that he was having a brake issue and that he had to actually lift and coast to keep the temperatures in check somewhat, so he really couldn't do much. But the fact is, though, there was a clear divide between both Sauber drivers instead of both of them just being slow, and they just having to make do with what the team had. No, Valtteri was able to do that slight bit more, and Zhou was miles behind everyone else. And again, technical issues aside, Zhou's really not making an impression, whereas Bottas is trying, whilst he's fighting for his life, to either remain with Sauber next year or try and find sanctuary as some kind of ambassador for Mercedes or something. But technical issues is something that cannot be said over at Haas, the Toyota influence making itself known already. And to find out why I think this is a bigger deal than many people might suspect, and it's really starting to prove its worth, go and watch this video next. The rumours were true, and there could be more to come from this partnership.